These are the lecture notes for chapter 31. This is part 2 actually, and I need to find we had covered epithelial and connective tissue. So we're going to start with muscle. There we go. Okay, so there are 3 types of muscle tissue. We're more familiar with skeletal muscle, of course. Here we go. All right, so muscular tissue is specialized for contraction, and all muscle tissue has the protein fibers actin and myosin, which enable the tissue to contract. The cells of muscle tissue are called muscle fibers, and there are 3 types. There's skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And most people understand about skeletal and cardiac. Skeletal muscle are the muscles that you use to move, and basically these are the muscles that when you go to the gym, these are the muscles that you're working, you know. The cardiac muscle, of course, is in the heart. But smooth muscle, sometimes called visceral muscle, sometimes people don't understand what that is and where it's located. So smooth muscle is found basically lining your tubes. So the tubes that form your airways, that move air through, your respiratory system, like your trachea and your bronchi and your bronchioles. All of those are lined with smooth muscle. And the lining of your digestive tract, all the way from your mouth and your throat and your stomach through your intestines, that is lined with smooth muscle that contracts and helps to move your digestive contents through. And the lining of your blood vessels that helps to move blood through, the blood, the circulatory system. So this is smooth muscle. Now, skeletal muscle, for one thing, is different from the other 2 types because it's voluntary. The fibers are long, they're elongated, and they are striated or striped. And they have many nuclei, so they're multinucleated. For smooth muscle, it is involuntary and has no striations. Cardiac muscle does have striations, but is involuntary and has one central nucleus. And here is a picture of skeletal muscle. You can see the striations. You can see that they're elongated cells because we can't even see the ends of the cells. This is just a part of a muscle cell or muscle fiber right here. You can see pushed up to the edge are the nuclei, and there are many nuclei. Then with your smooth muscle, they're spindle-shaped, so they are tapered at the ends, and they have a single nucleus and no striations. Then you have cardiac muscle, and you need to look closely, but there are striations in cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is branching and only has a single central nucleus. And there are connections between the cardiac muscle fibers called intercalated disc. And the involuntary muscle are the cardiac and the smooth, and then the voluntary, which you consciously control the contractions, is skeletal muscle. Now, moving on to nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is specialized to conduct electrical impulses. The cells of nervous tissue include nerve cells or neurons. A neuron consists of dendrites, a cell body, and an axon. We'll look at a picture in a minute. And axons are sometimes often surrounded by insulation called a myelin sheath. The one axon is called a nerve fiber. And then outside the brain and spinal cord, the nerve fibers are bound together by connective tissue, and that's what makes up a nerve. There are also cells called neuroglia that support and nourish the neurons or nerve cells. The brain has neuroglia called microglia, which can engulf and destroy bacteria and other pathogens. astrocytes, which basically the astrocytes form the blood-brain barrier. They keep the blood from contacting the neurons because blood carries harmful chemicals and harmful pathogens in it. That and once a neuron is becomes sick or is destroyed, you can't replace it. Now, there's a note here about Parkinson's disease. The astrocytes contain a glial cell-derived growth factor, and that is being studied as a possible treatment for Parkinson's disease. Then there are oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes. I always make my students in class say this word after I say it because it's just a funny word. But oligodendrocytes they produce the myelin sheath around the axons. Now, outside the brain, we have Schwann cells, which form myelin sheaths around axons in the peripheral nervous system, which is basically everything but your brain and your spinal cord, and ependymal cells, which form the cerebrospinal fluid. So those are the neuroglia, and this is a picture of a typical neuron. If you'll just focus on this neuron has a cell body. It has dendrites that surround the cell body and receive signals, and then it has a myelinated axon that conducts the nerve impulse to some target. And what you're also seeing is a picture of an astrocyte that maintains a separation between your blood vessels, your blood capillaries, and your neurons. So that's what we call the blood-brain barrier. There are some microglia that are shown here, and they're going to help in destroying pathogens. And then there's the oligodendrocyte, which wraps itself around the axon to form the myelin sheath. Okay, this is a list. I didn't highlight it, but this is a list of all the organ systems, which we're going to go over, but it shows some of the organ systems more than once, I think. Yeah, okay. So it just shows the organ systems and what life processes that they carry out. But there are 11 organ systems in the human, and we'll cover those. So this page shows you the body cavities. First, you have the dorsal cavity, which dorsal means your back. That's going to include the brain and the spinal cord, the cranial cavity, and the vertebral cavity, which contain your brain and spinal cord. Then you have your ventral cavity, which includes your chest and abdominal and pelvic cavities. So the chest cavity is called the thoracic cavity, and it contains the heart and the lungs. And then it's separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm, which is a muscle. The abdominal cavity contains your organs, and the pelvic cavity contains certain reproductive organs. So sometimes you call the abdominal and the pelvic cavity the abdominopelvic cavity together. And this is just a picture of your ventral body cavities, the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. Now we're going to move on and talk about the integumentary system, which includes the skin, some of your glands like your sweat and your oil glands, and it includes the hair and the nails. So the skin functions to cover and protect the underlying body. It also helps regulate body temperature through the action of sweating and also of forming goosebumps, you know, when your hair stands on end. And that is because the blood vessels in your skin are contracting and holding in heat. Then the skin also contains sensory receptors for heat, for pain, for pressure, for touch. And manufactures vitamin D when you're exposed to sunlight. Here is the anatomy of human skin. I just want you to look at the parts that form the skin. The skin itself is composed of the epidermis, which we already talked about is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So the epidermis is composed of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. The dermis is composed of connective tissue. It's composed of a reticular layer, and it's also composed of fibrous connective tissue layer. And then you have the hypodermis, which isn't technically a part of the skin itself, but it's underneath the skin, and it has a lot of fat tissue as well as loose connective tissue. The epidermis is composed of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. As you probably know, cells are formed from the bottom layer, and then they are pushed toward the outside surface of the skin, and as they move up toward the surface, they become keratinized, they die, and then we eventually lose them. They're shed, and then they're replaced by new skin. There are also cells in the epidermis that produce our pigment, our skin pigment called melanin. They are called melanocytes, and they will produce more melanin when they're exposed to ultraviolet radiation to protect you. And and the deeper layer of the skin is called the dermis. It is composed of fibrous connective tissue. It does contain sensory receptors, nerve fibers, and blood vessels. The blood vessels will supply the epidermis as well, because the epidermis does not contain blood vessels. Then you have the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis, which is loose connective tissue. Now, the accessory structures of the skin include the nails, the hair, and the sweat glands and oil glands. So, of course, the nails protect the fingers and the toes. Hair begins in the dermis and continues through the epidermis. Hair follicles contain sebaceous glands or oil glands. And then sweat glands are present in all regions of the skin. We do have different types of sweat in different areas. Some of the sweat is the, smelly sweat that doesn't smell very good, but some is just watery sweat. These are pictures of different skin cancers. The least harmful are basal cell carcinomas, and then squamous cell carcinomas, and you're able to have those surgically removed, but they don't tend to lead to death. They don't tend to be as dangerous. And then the melanoma can spread and is definitely the most dangerous of the skin cancers. Now, our last section is on homeostasis. All of the organ systems of the human body contribute to homeostasis. And before we do this, I keep looking for a list of the organ systems. So let's just go back. This is the only thing we have is this table. Let's just go back before we do homeostasis, and let's just talk about the organ systems. There are 11 organ systems. The ones that function in control of other systems is the nervous system and the endocrine system. And then the ones that function in movement, or the system that functions in movement, is the skeletal and muscular system together. Digestive system, of course, is for acquiring nutrients. Then we have respiratory system for gas exchange, cardiovascular system for transport, lymphatic system, which overlaps with the immune system. Then we have urinary system for eliminating waste, along with the digestive and respiratory. And because the respiratory eliminates carbon dioxide, which is a waste gas, and digestive, of course, eliminates undigestible material called feces. And then the immune and lymphatic system are really, you don't normally separate those into two different systems. So normally you would say lymphatic system, and I always teach them together when I teach them in anatomy and physiology. And of course, the reproductive system. Male and female reproductive system. So now we're going to move to the section called homeostasis, and I'm going to stop here and do that in the last recorded lecture.